welcome back, everyone. We have reached the pinnacle of our workshop today with the keynote lecture and the following podium discussion. Now it's my distinct honor to introduce our keynote lecturer, Dr. Eva Anagnostou Laoutides. She is Associate Professor at the Department of History and Archaeology at Macquarie University. So she has come all the way from Sydney, or rather Melbourne, to us. She had kind of a very traditional career initially as a classicist. Traditional in the sense that she focused very much on early Greek poetry and mythology, not so traditional by changing the locations of her studies, starting in Thessalonike, then moving on to Leeds and getting her PhD at Kent University. But that's still very much traditional. But then she got appetite to dig deeper and learn more, and she fell in love with the Near Eastern languages. And in 2009 and 2010, she added 4 language diplomas, one in Akkadian, one in cuneiform languages, one in Hittite, and one in Biblical Hebrew. And that then paved the way for another MA degree in ancient history with a focus on Akkadian at Macquarie University, at a time when she was already lecturing at Monash University in Melbourne. And then it was in 2018 that she was appointed at Macquarie University. And at that time, she was already an established and distinguished scholar. She was the future fellow of the Australian Research Council from 2017 to 2022. This was followed by an Australian Research Council discovery project on the crises of leadership in the Eastern Roman Empire. And that actually goes very far away from classical antiquity. That's from 250 to 1000 CE, which shows the range also in chronological terms of Eva's research. There are some further recent distinctions that I should mention. She's also the vice president of the Australian Numismatic Society. And also because I was so taken in by her energy and her skill that I was so glad that she accepted my invitation to become co-editor or to become a member of the editorial board of the book series Seleukid Perspectives. Her very latest distinction is, and it's so late, it's not even a full week old, is that she has been appointed an external member on the executive committee of the Executive Council of the Waterloo Institute for Hellenistic Studies. And we are really honored and pleased to can draw on your expertise and help, dear Eva. So there's a lot to celebrate, including the paper that you will be giving. And you have asked me to cut short the long list of your publications. And I will just, you ordered me to just tell the audience, if anyone is interested in the many books and articles and co-edited books, they may just check up her website. So I cut it short now. I thank you for having come all the way and spending these beautiful days with us. And we are now thrilled to hear your talk, Refounding Babylon under Seleukos, the Case of Syrian Stratonike.
Thank you so much. Before I start, can you hear me? Yeah. Yes. So I don't need to change the audio settings on my computer here?
No, not at all. It's all good.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Alta, you've managed to embarrass me, though I told you to cut it short. But anyway, thank you very much for this wonderful welcome and for attending today's conference. I'm very, very grateful to my hosts, Alta and Dorothea Joskun, who have pulled out all the stops to make this visit possible, but also enjoyable. A big thank you also to Andrew Faulkner for supporting this initiative. Now, as a visitor from Australia, I've learned that Waterloo is within the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Chinauton, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. Therefore, for my part, I also acknowledge the continuing accomplishments and contributions indigenous people make in shaping Waterloo region. It has been a long day full of excellent papers. Thus, my task of engaging you for the next hour is certainly not an easy one. Nevertheless, try I shall. I chose to speak about Stratonike, the second wife of the Seleucid dynasty. The sources present Stratonike as an alluring woman who could have broken the Seleucid family unit, threatening the future of their rule. Instead, Stratonike came to embody it. Her role in solidifying Seleucid diplomacy has attracted renewed scholarly attention in recent years, including by colleagues here in Waterloo and elsewhere in Canada. I also know that Altai is finishing a book on Seleucid queens, so there is more to look forward to. Since the 1970s, our understanding of ancient women has grown considerably, and in equal measure with our mistrust of ancient historical accounts, which we increasingly appreciate as constructs. The progress achieved further emphasizes the need for modern historians to be wary of our assumptions about ancient values and gender norms. To this direction, it is crucial to adopt a multidisciplinary approach that is informed by the material culture and captures as many contemporary perspectives as possible. Only then we can fathom credible answers to questions such as, what did it mean for a proud Macedonian to rule in Syria? What did it mean for a Sogdian princess like Apama to be publicly projected as Seleukos' royal wife? To what extent was Stratonike a willing part in the Seleucid appropriation of Mesopotamian royal traditions? And a personal question. Did Hellenistic queens ever had a my fat Greek wedding moment? You can't hear it, can you?
No.
Let me try. Can you? It's where it says. Don't worry. It's exactly. We must make him think it was his idea. Now, fun aside, substantiating the agency of Hellenistic royal women remains tricky. Thus, as I try to sketch Stratonike's profile as daughter, wife, queen, and goddess, I lean on theoretical insights from sociology and archaeology. I define, therefore, agency as conduct that is both constrained and enabled by contemporary social structures. My quest, thus, is to prove relational agency. In the brave new world of Alexander, why can't I change the slide? Voila. In the brave new world that emerged after Alexander's death, his successors were keen to proclaim themselves vasilis and to negotiate their roles creatively. Their early coinage reflects the fierce competition among them, in the context of which they boldly claimed divine favor, emulating, of course, Alexander. Here on the coins, you can see that they all promote themselves as vasilis, whether it is Lysimachos, Antigonos, Ptolemy, and, of course, Demetrios. Royal women soon followed, posing as avatars of powerful goddesses who could petition the kings on behalf of individuals and communities. Of course, Hellenistic queens are not a historical first. We have several examples of powerful palace women from Mesopotamian, Achaemenid, and Carian sources. Beyond cases of political manipulation and behind-the-scenes influence, as reported, for example, for Parysatis, the wife of Darius II, female political ambition is exemplified by Babylonian queens like Zakutu-Nakia, who signed a treaty demanding loyalty for her favorite grandson Ashurbanipal in around the 8th century BC, and the famous Artemisia in Caria. I won't talk about Samuramat now because she will be a case to discuss later in the lecture. Some of these women owed large estates and managed their own financial transactions, as evident from the Persepolis fortification archive and even Plato. I'd have to find a way to fit in a Plato here. Furthermore, the example of Amastris needs to be considered. Amastris, niece of Darius III and Crateros's wife at the Susa weddings before he chose Phila, Stratonike's mother, over her, came to rule in Heraclea in Pontus, founding her own city and minting her own coins as Vasilissa, as you can see here. Amastris arranged her own marriage to the king of Heraclea and issued coins on which she features as sole ruler. By no means the norm, depending on the circumstances and personal flair, as we saw in quite a few of the papers today, women harbored political ambition and did not hesitate to act on it. But what about Stratonike? What examples did she have closer at home? Closer to home. Stratonike was the daughter of the aforementioned Phila and Demetrios Bisiga, whom she married after the death of her other husband, Crateros. Phila was the first Macedonian woman to be given the title Vasilissa around 306 BC, at the same time as her husband and father-in-law styled themselves kings or in close succession to them, so roughly from 306 to 301 BC. Athenaeus reports that individuals who wanted to ingratiate themselves with Demetrios erected a temple to Phila at Athens, where she was honored as Phila Aphrodite. Plutarch also reports that she, of her own accord, had woven a robe for Demetrios on which she was presented in the company of gods. Phila had a true reputation for political diplomacy, mainly thanks to Hieronymus of Cardia, who was indebted to Antigonus. Antigonus, father of Demetrios, captured Hieronymus but spared his life and more or less gave him a chance to have a second career in his own court. Therefore, in exchange, Hieronymus wrote amazingly positive stuff for all the Antigones, including Phila. Okay. Probably drawing on Hieronymus, Diodorus describes Phila as part of Demetrius' military entourage in 316 BC, during which we are told she held audiences with soldiers, easing tensions in the camp and arranging marriages for poor girls at her own expense. Thus, she must have had access to considerable personal funds. Of course, she was the daughter of Antipater, Alexander's regent in Macedonia, and a political asset for all her three husbands. Notably, in an inscription from Samos, where the people declare her decision to honor Phila's Lycian bodyguard, you can see it here on the slide, no mention of the Antigonids is made. So the people decide that Demarchus, the son of Lycian Taron, is going to be given citizenship because when he spent time next to Vasilissa Phila, next to royal woman Phila, he showed himself to be very willing and loyal toward her. Phila was clearly part of Hellenistic dynasty making, undoubtedly a man's game, but she certainly knew how to navigate its rules. Like her mother, Stratonike's identity was also defined by her blood family. Stratonike is known to have made many dedications on the island of Delos. So I've included some of them here. The earliest reference to a dedication by Vasilissa Stratonike dates to 278 BC. The longer references describe her as daughter of Demetrios and Phila, so not wife of someone, and are copies from the early 2nd century. Notably, many years after her famous two marriages that we're going to talk about later today, Stratonike would still refer to herself as daughter of Demetrios, son of Antigonus. And this can be seen from a marble sphere she dedicated to Artemis in Sardis, where she likely resided after 281 BCE. The sphere was found next to the so-called Lydian building near the temple of Artemis. It is dated between 180 to 150 BCE and is thought to be a copy of an earlier original, which may even predate the foundation of the temple, the building of the temple. However, while Stratonike became known became known for her rich dedications to the Delian Artemis, the goddess she chose to worship or associate herself with in reality is Persian Anaitis, which in Sardis and across ancient Lydia and Phrygia was identified with Artemis. Artemis Anaitis represented the prosperity and power of the cities that worshipped her, later sharing her traits with goddess Tuche, the fortune of the Hellenistic cities. But she was still worshipped as an Aphrodite-type goddess due to her connection with water sources and fertility. Let me explain. The Antigonids had a special connection to Kelene, a city in southwest Phrygia, where Demetrios Besieger spent the formative years of his childhood from the age of 6 to 15 or 16. The bond, primarily strategic but surely emotional too, is stressed by the fact that Demetrios returned at Kelene with Phila around 319 BCE, probably just in good time for her to have their first child, his son Antigonos Gonatas. Stratonike was born a few years later, sometime between 318 and 315 BC. Kelene was at the time a cosmopolitan place, and like his father, Demetrios chose to settle his young family there, while he participated in the Second War of the Successors, fighting in Cilicia in 316, and then raiding Babylonia and even Babylon itself in 311. By 380 BC, by 308 BC, he was forced to relinquish the upper satrapies to Seleukos, and then the following year, Demetrios turned his attention to Athens. Athens is a city that had always a special place in Demetrios' heart, but it didn't last for long this time round. In 306, Demetrios embarked on his Cyprian campaign, conquering Salamis, a stronghold of the Ptolemies. It is here that his family resided for a few years until 295 BC. The following year, Ptolemy was able to recapture Salamis, and in fact, he took Demetrios' mother and children as prisoners, though he later released them, treated them very well, and later released them. The sources, I've included the sources, did I? Yes, I did. I've included the sources on the slide, so you can see Diodorus and Plutarch. By this time, however, Stratonike was already a married woman living in Asia. In other words, young Stratonike was mostly raised in Phrygia. In fact, she spent a large part of her childhood in Xerxes' palace in Kelene, a place that Antigonus had called home, her father-in-law had called home, since Alexander had appointed him satrap of Greater Phrygia in 333 BC. The only time that the Antagonists were not there was 2 years, roughly around the time that the Triparadissus settlement took place. Persian influence at Kelene was strong and remained so long after the city came under Macedonian control. In fact, many Persian expatriates continued to live in the area, nursing the Zoroastrian traditions promoted by Darius II, and looking after the local temple of Anahit. Kelene was in fact refounded by Antiochus I, very close to the original settlement, as Apamia, precisely because of its Iranian past, which would please Antiochus' own Iranian mother, Apama. That's why the city was renamed Apamia, also known as Apamia on the Meander or Apamia Sibotus. The place, the new city, also boasted a temple to Artemis Anaitis. Iranian aristocracy had been successfully incorporated into the Greek civic apparatus, and hence among the local mint masters, we come across later on the name of an Iranian called Mefernis. You can see him here in the, as I look at the screen, right-hand side, bottom corner. You can vaguely see the names, Mefernu. Bronze coins from Apamea would continue to depict the local Artemis Anaitis in a variety of ways that speak to the level of syncretism at play in the region. On some coins from the mid-2nd century BC, we see Artemis as a turreted figure. On the reverse, Marsyas is represented as playing his flute near the river Meander. Yet, we also have coins representing the Celtic statue of Artemis with fillets and calathus on her head, in a posture that evokes the famous statue of Artemis at Ephesus, but quite probably other local statues as well as we know that there have been many more all around Lydia and Phrygia. All of this started as a campaign of Darius II to promote Iranian deities across the Mesopotamian regions that he controlled before the Macedonians came into the scene. For example, although we have no temple of Artemis Anahit in Lydia and Hypepa, we do know the place is described in our sources. So if so many written sources insist that there was a temple there, they can't have made it up. Surely a structure existed there at some point. We also know from Pausanias that there were sanctuaries, a fair few sanctuaries of the goddess in the whole region. Tacitus further reports a shrine in Hierokesaria dedicated to the Persian Diana, Diana being the Latin name of Artemis, possibly dating since the time that Cyrus the Younger was satrap of Lydia. That was between 407 and 401 BCE. Xenophon also reported an open-air altar of Artemis in Sardis, dated to the last quarter of the 6th century BC. We don't know exactly where it was, but Xenophon took an Anabasis. He was there when Cyrus the Younger delivered a speech on this shrine, so he talks from an eyewitness perspective. In other words, Stratonike was well versed in religious syncretism, the religious syncretism which had taken Asia Minor by storm already since the Achaemenid times. Stratonike was a local. As such, Stratonike, here I've just included more coins and an element, an inscription from 300 BC that shows a process of translating Persian names to Greek names was already underway at that time. So the person that dedicated this inscription, it's the base of the statue, called Vakinalis, translates that to Dionysioklis, clearly an Iranian that wants to pose as a legitimate Greek citizen of the region. Now, all of that makes me think that, in fact, Stratonike was a unique match for Apama, Seleukos' first wife, unlike the commonly held view that the two queens, and I quote, came from very different backgrounds. While Apama was a Sogdian princess well-versed in Greco-Macedonian cults and honorific customs, Stratonike was a Macedonian princess well-versed in the cults of Lydia and Phrygia. Both took on the title Basilissa, royal woman, and engaged in building projects and cultural diplomacy. Although Antiochos was less prominent, and here you can see inscriptions dedicated to Apami in Greek, and then you can see inscriptions dedicated to her in Akkadian. And of course, from Lucian later on, we know that Stratonike herself had her own statues set up in a number of temples. Here it's the temple of Atargatis that Lucian is mentioning here particularly. In other words, there is so much cross-contamination and exchange between the two cultures, and it seems to be quite unproblematic. Although Antiochus was less prominent at the time of Seleukos' nuptials with Stratonike, there was hardly anyone more suitable to replace Apama in the next generation of the Seleucids, whether we want to accept that Apama had died by the time Seleukos took Stratonike as his wife or not. And we'll touch upon this later on. Let us now discuss Stratonike as wife. The marriage of Seleukos and Stratonike takes place around 299 to 298 BC, and it was, of course, politically motivated. It assisted Seleukos in stabilizing the northern frontier of his newly acquired Syrian territories after the Battle of Ipsos. And here you can see on the map how things change after the Battle of Ipsos. Seleukos' victory shifted drastically the power balance between the successors, necessitating a frenzied round of new alliances. Besides, it was an attempt to balance the marriage alliance of Ptolemy with Lysimachos, which took place not long after the battle. Lysimachos married Arsinoe II, daughter of Ptolemy and Berenice, his second wife, in 300 or 299 BC. We also know that at a later stage, this alliance became even stronger because Lysimachos' son Agathocles was married to another daughter of Ptolemy, Lysandra. It's great that these guys have large families, so whenever they decide to strengthen their family ties, there is another daughter to be married off somewhere. Stratonike's marriage was brilliantly celebrated. Demetrios and Phila delivered their daughter in glamour, we are told, by sailing with an entire fleet from Thracian Chersonese to Rossus in Seleucia, Pieria. Perhaps they made a stop to Cyprus on the way to collect some family members. Nevertheless, this didn't stop Demetrios from raiding a couple of places on the way. For example, he raided Kinta, and he tried to reoccupy Cilicia, gaining considerable booty and making a point about his persistent ambition and aggression. It has been suggested that Demetrios' threat played a role in Seleukos' decision to marry Stratonike with his son, his own son, a few years later, in 294 BCE. If you think, ooh, scandal, that's what quite a few ancient historians thought, as we will see in a minute. Seleukos arranged for Antiochos and Stratonike to leave Asia Minor after their marriage for the eastern satrapies, where Antiochos governed as co-regent. According to tradition, however, Antiochos fell in love with his stepmother, and he was withering away until his father bravely decided to save the young man's life by giving up Stratonike and allowing his son to marry her. Leaving this lore aside for a moment, in my view, at this stage, Seleukos appears more concerned with consolidating the Seleucid power in the east rather than with dealing with domestic dramas, including a potential collusion between Stratonike and her father. By then, Demetrius' penchant for plundering cities had likely made him unpopular in Cilicia, not unlike the way he had managed to displease the Babylonians with his harsh plundering of the city in 311 BC, early in his military career. Perceiving Demetrius' ambition getting out of hand and fearing Lysimachos from the north, always a threat, Seleukos was likely preparing for another round of conflict. Thus, it would be prudent in this situation to affirm Seleucid rule over the lands which had first recognized the potential of his royal oikos. Furthermore, it would make no sense for Seleukos to entrust Stratonike to his son, who was now saddled with the additional task of undertaking his own anabasis, if he thought of her in suspicious terms. Engels and Erickson recently argued that the presence of Artemis and Apollo on these coins, on these golden coins that I have on the slide, struck by Antiochos during the time of his anabasis, were possibly designed to point to the presence of the queen on the side of the crown prince. Which is a good idea, and I liked it for a time, until I thought, well, it's not easy to reconcile the argument with the fact that on the coins, if Apollo stands for Antiochos and Artemis stands for Stratonike, the king celebrated is still Seleukos. It creates a rather awkward, if not embarrassing, triangle right there on the coin. So I had to think twice about the argument. In my view, these coins rather represent an effort to cement the royal claims of the Seleucids under the protection of gods widely accepted for their king-making abilities. Apollo was increasingly associated with the Babylonian Marduk, while Artemis, represented on the coins, is probably a Greek version of Nanea, a Mesopotamian goddess worshipped at Susa, but also Borsippa. The syncretism between Artemis and Nanea is widely attested at Susa and Dura Europos, while we also have a single inscription, later inscription of about 100 CE, from Piraeus dedicated to the goddess. What I've included in this slide is just evidence that Artemis and Nanea were syncretized, and that in fact there is so much syncretism going on that later on, when Antiochus IV made an attack on the temple in Elymais, he calls the goddess Aphrodite. Other historians, like Polybius, call her Artemis, while in the Maccabees we see her as Nanea. So the interpretation is very fluid, as long as it suits the imperial ambitions of the people that project the goddess, then she can be any of these. And here you can see a very early representation of Nanea from the sanctuary of Artemis in Dura Europos. And I've also put on the slide the later dedication to Artemis Nanea, where you can actually see her name in Greek letters. Unique sample from Piraeus. Antiochus coins then rather exemplify the syncretism that many dynasties before the Seleucids had also found politically useful. Here, it is also worth mentioning that although the Persian Anahita was never equated with Mesopotamian goddesses, she definitely acquired Ishtar, Aphrodite-like characteristics, especially under the Perso-Babylonian court of Artaxerxes II and his sons. We tend to think of the Persians as the guys that the Greeks defeated at Marathon, but we don't think of them as the very successful rulers of Babylon for a long, long time, where Iranian and Babylonian traditions had ample time to fruitfully merge. Okay, so here Berosus himself says that the practice of Persians to worship statues was introduced by Artaxerxes, son of Darius Ochos. He was the first to have a statue. Here we don't have Artemis Anaitis anymore, but Aphrodite Anaitis right in Babylon, Susa, and Ecbatana. And he orders his subjects to worship those goddesses. Notice that there are two edicts, one addressing Babylon, Susa, and Ecbatana, and another addressed to Persians, Bactrians, Damascus, and Sardis. Probably two edicts addressing two different traditions in the regions that he is trying to force or prompt to worship Aphrodite Anaitis. In other words, the king is aware that locally the traditions differ. Therefore, he needs to give different orders to different parts of his empire. Okay. Okay, let me comment for a moment on Stratonike's marriage to Antiochus and the love affair. The episode certainly excited the imagination of writers and artists well beyond antiquity. Undeniably, the story of Antiochus falling desperately in love with his young stepmother was a publicity stunt conveniently hatched by the Seleukid court. Ancient authors rendered Antiochus' symptoms in literary terms, with Plutarch openly comparing Antiochus' passion to Sappho's famous poem 31. So you can hear, "Εγίνετο τη Σάπφους εκείνα." So he had exactly the same symptoms that Sappho describes when she falls in love in poem 31. You can't miss it. It's so much literature, so much fiction. Plutarch mentions that Seleukos had to persuade Antiochus and Stratonike to marry in front of a full assembly, while in Appian's account, it is the assembly of Macedonians that must be convinced of the legitimacy of Seleukos' actions. Some have also claimed that Seleukos conducted himself in this matter as a Persian great king, calling his soldiers and telling them what to do. But in my view, his actions were meant to ensure loyalty to Antiochus, the new king, whom by this point he had not yet recognized as his co-ruler and successor in any formal way. We obviously know very little about what the newlyweds thought, especially as Stratonike already had a daughter by Seleukos. But in urging his son to marry Stratonike, Seleukos did nothing different to Antiochus urging his son Demetrios to marry Phila. In fact, the story goes, Demetrios was rather displeased with the marriage because Phila was twice older than him, if not more. So he kind of whispered to his dad's ear, "Must I, Dad?" And his dad said, "Well, son, you better work for profit." So why should Stratonike and Antiochus be any different? Our ancient sources and also modern scholars show great understanding at Demetrius' predicament, who was asked to marry a woman so older than him, even trying to explain that Demetrius, and that's actually in a recent otherwise very good book, Demetrius probably developed a liking for older women because of this first experience. At the same time, it seems appropriate for Stratonike to have been ambivalent about the relationship, or at least to have to appear to be this way. Regardless, one thing is certain. Seleukos needed his army to support Antiochus in his gradual ascent to power, and pledging him his own wife was an excellent way of achieving it. It was as if the old royal couple was now replenished with a new couple that had excellent potential for reproduction, which is indeed what happened. The first tablet to record the co-regency of Seleukos and Antiochus is dated on November 294, the year that the marriage took place. Besides, although endogamy was long associated with the Persian court, it was not foreign to the Greco-Macedonians of this time, especially among the members of the elite. One example that immediately crops to mind is that of Memnon of Rhodes and his brother Mentor, so Memnon and Mentor, already in the mid-4th century. They married their sister to Artavazos II, and they got successively married to his daughter Barsini. No probes. The fact that Antiochus and Stratonike went on to have at least 4 children is indicative of the success of the union, which also, we are told, pleased her father Demetrios. After all, the future of the Seleucids lay with Antiochus, and from his perspective, Demetrios would thus retain his closeness to the leader of the dynasty. What, therefore, is scandalous in the sources does not seem to bother the protagonists all that much. Okay. Are you fine? Am I talking too fast? Am I talking too much information? Conscious break. I'm now going to move on to talking about Stratonike as queen. Antiochus was already keen to promote the tale of his family's divine ancestry, and it was under his rule that the Apollon the Omphalos coins were minted in the eastern satrapies. Following his father, Antiochus understood he needed to assert his legitimacy in the place where the dynasty was born, Babylon. In a recent talk, I suggested that the Apollon the Omphalos imagery may also point to Marduk taking up his seat in Babylon. Happy to entertain any questions in the discussion time. Furthermore, while in charge of the upper satrapies, including Mesopotamia and Babylonia, Antiochus showed considerable interest in restoring temples and supporting local cults. Therefore, Antiochus is called crown prince in the Sin chronicle that you see on the slide of 287 BCE, where he is described as making offerings to the two temples of Sin. Then we also have the Esagila chronicle, recording Antiochus' care for rebuilding Marduk's temple in Babylon, while in the famous Antiochus Cylinder, found in Borsippa and dated in 250 BCE, Antiochus poses as the caretaker of Esagila and Ezida, and he is described as foremost son of Seleukos, the king, the Macedonian king of Babylon. Ezida was the temple of Nabu, Marduk's son, and of his wife Tashmetu. In the Cylinder, Stratonike's name is recorded as Astartanikou. I agree with recent arguments that the Niku part of the name is just the Akkadian transliteration and has little to do with the verb niaku, which means to be adulterous, to fornicate. It would be appropriate for such a joke to be implied in an official cylinder placed in the foundation of the Ezinda. Its scandalous aura reflects more the Greco-Roman historiographical tradition rather than the way the Babylonian priesthood operated. In Antiochus' prayer, Stratonike is addressed as, Stratonike is addressed as Hirtu, divine consort, and Sharatu, heavenly queen, titles meant to exalt her divine status. According to the Chicago Syrian Dictionary, Hirtu is meant to highlight the equal status between husband and wife. Stratonike's death in 254 BC is also recorded in the Babylonian astronomical diaries of 253, a year later. There, Stratonike is given yet another title, that of Beltu, lady, a title often attributed to the goddess Tashmetu in the context of her sacred marriage to Nabu. So her divinity is highlighted all of the time in a manner that is unusual for the Babylonian queens. They are palace women, they are royal women, but they are never divine women. They are not Sharatu, and they're certainly not Beltu. The Seleucids, therefore, seem to be very keen to emphatically propagate Babylonian royal traditions in which the harmony between the king and the queen reflects cosmic harmony and predicts divine favor and prosperity. Their efforts are most certainly coordinated with the help of the local priesthood, with notable attention to the status of the queen, which actively participates in the founding of the dynasty. In fact, given that the Seleucids are known city founders, the unusual emphasis on the queen's titles may reflect an attempt by Babylonian priesthood to stress Babylon's status as the first, the true capital of the dynasty. Maybe then the priests are also issuing a mild complaint to the Seleucids. You are building too many capitals, you are transferring your authority and Babylonian royal traditions everywhere in the empire, but we are the only ones that will call the queen Sharatu, Hirtu, and Beltu. Despite her devotion to versions of Artemis, Stratonike was also associated with other goddesses, notably Aphrodite and, more names for you, Atargatis Derketo, also known, because the Romans really couldn't possibly pronounce that thing, as the Syrian goddess. So they simplify things. In my view, Stratonike's association with Aphrodite served as a Seleucid response to their increasing antagonism with the Ptolemies after Ipsos, which led to the Syrian wars. In this context, the suggestion that the Seleucids highlighted the motherly aspects of their queens rather than their sexual potency needs to be revised. Aphrodite, long recognized as the protectress of the Ptolemaic fleet, was explicitly associated with Ptolemaic queens such as Arsinoe II. Arsinoe was worshipped by sailors, but also in domestic settings, sometimes in association with Isis, the Egyptian goddess that the Greeks had most closely associated with Aphrodite, and increasingly linked with the sea in the Hellenistic period. Here, for example, we have a fragmentary relief set up by a sailor depicting Arsinoe in Egyptian attire and headdress and inscribed with a bilingual dedication. Similar evidence we have for Berenice II. Beyond, let me see, yes, so here is Berenice II. Beyond Callimachus' poem that speaks about the queen becoming immortal through Aphrodite's touch, private citizens too worshipped the queen. We know, for example, of a guy called Mahatas who at some point lived in the Fayum, and he built a shrine of the Syrian goddess and Aphrodite Berenice. Given that Antiochus had built in honor of his wife the city Stratonike in Caria, a region that came under Ptolemaic control by the end of the First Syrian War, it seems reasonable that Stratonike would seek to inspire a similar cult to antagonize that of Ptolemaic queens. Stratonike, in fact, was built on a land where many indigenous cults were flourishing, and the Greeks just translated the local Jews as Jews chrysaros, but this didn't mean anything. It is pretty obvious that the cult there was an indigenous cult. Caria, in general, hosted numerous time-honored cults of Aphrodite, or cults of goddesses that the Greeks happily identified with Aphrodite, as evident from the name of the most prominent Carian city called Aphrodisias. Now, I also mentioned another goddess, the Syrian goddess, Atargatis or Derketo. Now, she was also worshipped in Caria, but mainly across Syria. Why is she important? She was the mother of Semiramis, or Shamuramat, legendary founder and queen of Babylon. Shamuramat had a reputation of inciting incurable passions with her amazing beauty. Although in the Babyloniaca, dedicated to Antiochus, Berosus rejects this mythic tradition, the Seleucids were apparently keen on the myth. So we are told that the passion of Ninus for Semiramis was so intense that drove her first husband Onis to hang himself in a fit of despair. Therefore, suddenly, Shamuramat became available to become the wife of Ninus. From a Seleucid perspective, it has been argued the triangle Seleukos, Stratonike, and Antiochos could reflect that of Ninus, Semiramis, and Onis, and nicely interweave the Seleucids into local Babylonian traditions. At Aphrodisias, Ninus and Semiramis were depicted, where am I? I lost this a sentence, sorry. Yes, indeed. Ninus and Semiramis were prominently celebrated in a mosaic at Daphne, the suburb of Antioch on the Orontes, the Western capital of the Seleucids. So you can see that this way they're transferring Babylonian traditions onto their Western capital. At Aphrodisias, Ninos and Semiramis were depicted on a sculptured basilica frieze along with an image of the Aphrodisian goddess dated from the late 1st century. Stratonike allegedly rebuilt a temple of Atargatis at Hierapolis Bambiki early in her queenship, surely aware of the Semiramis legend. And furthermore, so this is the mosaic from Daphne on the Orontes. And further, these coins, silver obols, that Seleukos likely minted at Hierapolis, depicting a turreted head of Atargatis on the obverse, although I've discussed this with the director of ACANS, the Numismatic Center at Macquarie. It's very difficult to actually identify the turreted goddess with Atargatis. That's the description you find on all coin catalogs, but there are many turreted goddesses. She can be a number of goddesses. For some reason, because the coin is struck in Hierapolis Bambiki, she is identified as Atargatis, the local goddess. And there is some value in this identification, though it cannot be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Now, I would hesitate, regardless of all this, to accept that Stratonike or the Seleucids willfully promoted her as an adulterous wife. The scandalous story, which captivated the imagination of historians like Diodorus and caused Berosus to express his indignation at the incorrigible romantic tendencies of the Greeks, was likely hatched as political propaganda to articulate the power of the queen. After all, the true historical Shammuramat, the Assyrian wife of Shamshi-Adad V, had ruled the Neo-Assyrian Empire as his regent for 5 years, before her son came of age and was able to rule. We even know that she participated in battle, the only Mesopotamian queen to ever be present in a battle. And notably, she is also described daughter-in-law of Shalmanu-Asharedu, king of 4 quarters. So very much in the way that later Hellenistic royal women describe themselves through their family relations. The tradition likely originates in the relentless competition of the Seleucids with the Ptolemies, known from Theocritus, Idyll 15, and other Hellenistic poetry that publicly celebrated the love of Aphrodite for Adonis. In the same way that Arsinoe II, for example, is not reproached but rather admired for seeking to be identified with Aphrodite as she causes and mourns the death of her Assyrian husband Adonis, so Stratonike poses as a powerful Semiramis, the earthly version of Derketos' daughter. The adultery part is what the Greek historians or Greco-Roman historians like, but I don't think that this was part of the original story. The competition between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies is also depicted, in my view, in the anecdotes regarding the rude painting of Ctesicles, the queen's affair with Combambos, but also the tradition about the poetic praise of Stratonike's bald head. So please bear with me as I try to cover all bases related to Stratonike's tradition, and so these final 3 episodes of what's going on with her. A page. According to Pliny, Ctesicles depicted Stratonike as romping with a fisherman. Ctesicles exhibited the picture in the harbor at Ephesus before escaping by sea. The queen, however, was surprisingly flattered. It's been suggested that this is a narrative that represents a misunderstanding of a cult painting that depicted the queen as Aphrodite and perhaps attempted to project Seleucid maritime sovereignty. I'd like to refine this argument further. I think that the painting is likely associated with the cult of Derketo, the fish-bodied goddess, in response to the Ptolemaic Isis Aphrodite we discussed above. Equally, Lucian's tale about Stratonike's wanting to award the poet who would praise best her non-existent hair, an illness we are told had made the queen completely bald, fits very well with Callimachus' famous praise of the lock of Berenice. The lock of Berenice, the lock of the Ptolemaic queen, who vowed to dedicate her hair for the safe return of her husband from his Syrian campaign. What Lucian points to, consciously or not, is the extreme competition between the two royal houses. Lucian also relates the tale of Combambos, a handsome friend of Seleukos to whom he had trusted Stratonike during a journey to Hierapolis. Knowing the queen to be lustful, Combambos feared that she will fall for him. To avoid any accusation of misconduct, Combambos castrated himself and kept his severed member in a jar, which he duly produced to the king when, indeed, the queen fell for him and malicious gossip started spreading. Grateful to his faithful servant, Seleukos showered Combambos with presents and built a statue in his honor after his death. The story has many parallels to narratives about oversexed goddesses who threaten and emasculate the objects of their desire. You can think of Attis Cybele, who was worshipped at Sardis, Gilgamesh and Ishtar, Aphrodite, and Adonis. Half more page, and I please beg for your patience. As we go to discuss Stratonike as goddess. Two decrees dating after Stratonike's death refer to a sanctuary of Aphrodite Stratonikis at Smyrna. Stratonike's relationships with Smyrna and her dedications to the city seem to date after her husband's arrival in Asia Minor in 276, when he tried and failed to recover Syria Kili from Ptolemy II. This coincides with her other cult inscriptions in Asia Minor, including joint honors for her and her husband at Teos, the island of Teos, and in the cult of the Ionian Koinon. Her activity would then coincide with that of her husband in the region. When Smyrna reconciled with Magnesiad Scipilum at the end of the Third Syrian War, the Smyrnaeans were asked to swear an oath to the Magnesians by a number of gods, and these gods included Stratonikean Aphrodite. The goddess, in other words, was an expression of both groups' loyalty to the Seleucids, and their agreement was to be inscribed and set up in the sanctuary of Aphrodite Stratonikis in Smyrna and Artemis Leucophreni in Magnesia on the Meander. Therefore, the two cults are equal. They correspond. At that time still, Stratonike also received worship by private individuals and households at Smyrna, just as we saw for Ptolemaic queens, although Seleukid involvement in support of the cult continued. So let me conclude. While women still operated within a strict patriarchal system, the semiotics of which they understood well, we must not underestimate how exciting the times were for both kings and their consorts, especially since royal women were the kingmakers, securing blood connections to the Macedonian royalty and the first generation of Alexander's Philoi. Handling their own wealth and often their own courts, acting as patronesses and intermediaries to the kings, Hellenistic queens competed with one another as much as with their male counterparts and even their husbands at times for glory. While unable to control their destinies completely, Hellenistic royal women lived at a time that the world craved for their allure and was obsessed with their seductive power as much as they feared it. Furthermore, my reading of the evidence suggests that for the Hellenistic monarchies, gender was an issue secondary to dynastic rivalry. The actions of Hellenistic royal women were only judged from a gender perspective when this suited their political opponents or prude historians. And I hope that Stratonike's case goes to some way to prove that. So thank you very much for your patience. Am I terribly over time?
We can still have 10-15 minutes of discussion. That was an amazing survey going into all the different local traditions, showing the close engagement with the cultural traditions by the Seleucid dynasty, and where I think part of the discussion may try to elucidate a little bit more closely your argument is the question: who was the driver of that engagement? And what I think is a little bit more implicit in your argument is that you think that Stratonike had a more active role, which we were trying to argue with her upbringing, which I never took into consideration. That was actually new to me. So that is definitely, for me, a new additional perspective. However, when we look at agents, we can also think of the king and of the court and of the locals, especially the local priests. So the Babylonian priests, of course, as we know, always took a very active role. But we should assume that in principle for all local priests in their interaction. So if I may ask the first question, what makes you so confident that Stratonike played a more active role in shaping the imagery of the queen than other queens, say, of the Seleucids or of the Ptolemies might have played, other than assuming the knowledge and the understanding that she might have had of a variety of local traditions?
First, I thank you for the question. I think she was much more fluent in the efforts of the royal house altogether and the various consultants that the royal house used, including the priests. We do know from previous dynasties, from Achaemenid queens, that often local priests petitioned the queen or had direct correspondence with the queen about buildings or activities that the queen was sponsoring. And I think that Stratonike did exactly the same, and certainly the dedications in Babylon at the Esagila seem to imply that she has equal status to Antiochos. The point, though, that I was trying to make is not so much that she is different to other queens. In fact, what I was trying to say is that we don't have to wait until later on, until Laodiki in the Seleucid succession, to think of Seleucid queens as really engaging with the dynastic policy making. It's right there from the beginning. It starts with Apama. It very worthily continues with Stratonike, who is able to make dedications, who is able to project herself as proud daughter of Antigonus, who acts as her own woman.
Thank you for that clarification. I think it will also help the discussion. And I ask for questions, and Stone, I think, is coming first.
Yes. So a very quick question. First of all, thank you very much. That's a lot of information. And I personally was also fascinated with Stratonike. And because I was reading through BCHP, and I think there was one also from the Babylonian astronomical diaries where Stratonike was actually personally leading the offering and the sacrifice in Babylon. And I think that was practically unheard of. And this, I think, was 276 BCE. And it was actually quite detailed, I believe. Like she was like offering some bull, following your last comment, would it be fair to say that this is perhaps the fact that we only have this as the kind of only case of a Seleucid or possibly even Hellenistic queen personally conducting sacrifice, which is obviously typically reserved for the male monarch? Perhaps is it fair to say that this actually is probably not as uncommon as we think it is, that perhaps there are just others?
Yes.
It's just that the evidence are not preserved.
Thank you so much for this. That's the argument that I was trying to make, and that's why I started with all these other Mesopotamian, Achaemenid, and Carian queens, in order to show that, yes, the evidence that we have implies that these are exceptions, but in fact they are not. If you think back, like how many examples can one adduce? But if you think back to the Hittites, for example, you have Puduhepa, and she's right there on the carvings offering libation with her husband. Now, you can always say, well, she's clearly in the company of her husband, so her agency is diminished or minimized. But I really don't think that this is the case. These women have dedications, inscriptions dedicated to themselves, for themselves. And as you say, the astronomical diaries and the bit of information that we have tend to support this argument that their role is far more crucial than we tend to make out. The other argument that I was trying to push, because I have to say, at the end of collating all the information, I figured out there were quite a few arguments that I wanted to bring together, and I really don't know how successfully I've done it, is that we often think of the Ptolemies, the arch enemies of the Seleucids, as the one who had figured it all out right away. They have powerful queens, they have Arsinoe, they have Berenice, later on, of course, they have Cleopatra. They lead the game. And the Seleucids, oh no, they are this odd dynasty with the many capitals at the other side of the, of the world. And their queens are really much more reserved and probably only put forward for their motherly qualities. And I think, no, these guys just live in the same era. They have the same cultural experiences. They're as savvy as the others. It's our perceptions that at this point lead scholarship rather than the evidence guiding us. Does this answer your question and maybe a bit more, Stone?
Yes, I appreciate that very much. And in fact, when, like, for example, that body evidence of Stratonike in Babylon was discussed, I remember previous discussion, not today, of course, but like previous discussion, it was always mentioned in relation to Antiochus and how her action are somehow sanctioned by Antiochus or something like that. But perhaps I think you're absolutely right that there could be a lot of her personal agency in play here. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Further questions or comments?
If you're too tired, we can take it to the next.
I'm sure there is more, if only that Stratonike is really the most intriguing of the Seleucid queens. And I would make that the little question whether she is or whether she is not different from other queens. How can it be that we have so much evidence for Stratonike from so many different areas, cities, in so many different languages, that we do not have for any other of the Seleucid queens? That is remarkable, especially for a time for which we have so little historiographical information. And so it's quite against the odds that we have so much information on her, and others that have much more coverage in the literary tradition, such as Laodike I or Laodike the Third. They do not have that coverage of the sexualized queen, or the let's say sexualized or incarnation of Aphrodite or variation of Aphrodite. That seems to me still somewhat unique in the Seleucid context.
That needs to be explained. Look, in a way you are right, but I think the circumstances explain it, because this is the first generation and the dynasty has not been established as yet. So the changing hands from Seleukos to Antiochos needs to be very, very carefully orchestrated. It also happens at a time when the clash between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids intensifies. This is when the first Syrian wars take place. That's when the Seleucids actually lose, because in the end, the Ptolemies are far more powerful and they lose Syria Kili. They thought they would have it forever, they thought it was theirs, and therefore Stratonike, the queen, needs to step up, along with the rest of the royal family, to make a claim. And that's why I think you have so much evidence, because now it's the time for all the cults and all the statements to be made.
Okay, thank you.
I had to think much more about the late Hellenistic dynasts. So especially the Orontides and Commagene, which are in some way the descendants of the Seleucids in their own view, let us say this way. Yeah. And I think in Nemrut-Dagi, they're trying to make a connection via the matrilinear direction to the Seleucids. So I'm wondering if these, let us say, powerful female characters are here an interesting bonding point for the Orontides, to say we have these strong female characters, and with that we can also say we are part of the Seleucids and we have this, let us say, heritage or so. Is there something in the sources for that, or?
You mean for the later dynasties?
Yes.
Well, the first example that pops to mind is the Stratonike that has this letter exchange with Attalus III, where she's trying to establish a cult of Sabazios, who often poses as the consort of Artemis. Again, another woman who's really, really taking the lead and says, now we need to make concerted efforts to introduce a new cult that probably speaks to the customs of the people. So I would think the Seleucids, like the other Hellenistic dynasties, do not mind playing with local traditions at all, as long as they serve the empire. And what I was trying to say is that Babylon is where Seleukos is. Mm. And if Babylonian traditions can serve Seleukos, now they are Seleukid traditions. And there is nothing problematic with that. It doesn't prevent them from being proud Macedonians in any way. It doesn't compromise their identity. Everybody is in this game of cultural exchange. So yes, I think you are right. I think they can't afford to lose the queens in this game. The queens are always there and always offer important help in cementing the regimes.
Interesting. So in this way, you could also explain this phenomenon of Pythodorus or Demetrios or people like that to have been such powerful roles. It is a long tradition they can connect to, right?
Which, sorry?
Pythodorus of maybe Pontus or Dynamis, these very big Hellenistic queens of the late times. So they are in this tradition, you could say. Yes. Yeah.
Look, I definitely think so. And sometimes you have to allow for personal flaws as well. I mean, we do know of Macedonian generals who threw their daughters to jail because they sided with their husbands more than the fathers liked. So you have to take family dynamics into account. They are a Greco-Macedonian dynasty after all. So family dynamics play a big role. But at the formal level, I don't think that the Seleucids ever tried to curb the presence of the queens or gender agendas. There wasn't, I don't think, any gender agenda. The gender agenda comes from us, not from them.
Would agree with that. Thank you.
Okay, I think this is a time where we pause the discussion, because the discussion will be ongoing for sure. But thank you, Eva, very much again for this fascinating talk.